We live in an administrative state. The modern state is an administrative state. To the extent it's rooted in common law, certainly here in the UK, Canada, the United States, the Commonwealth nations, and others that have followed that model. It is an administrative state. Why is that important? What is that distinction? We're saying, in effect, that power is exercised not through the legislative, not through the judicial, but through the executive. And in that context, administrative law, and what we understand as compliance, those institutions upon which we rely to provide for safety, fairness, and equity, food safety, healthcare and life sciences, transport, infrastructure, utilities, energy, the environment. Each of these is deeply rooted, and around that is the fabric and a framework of law and regulatory bodies and agencies upon which we rely to protect our interests. Why is that important? Why are we starting today when talking about distributed ledger technology and blockchain? Because, as Paul suggested, what blockchain technology is introducing is as much about a philosophical change, the essence around ideas, and it is emerging. And for those of you who have been rooted in this for some years, you know, out of the Bitcoin community coming now 10 years on was a fundamental challenge to one sector of society, one aspect of our lives, and that is the intermediation around financial transactions. That was the purpose and the project and the focus. More broadly, within this community, the ambitions go to tearing down, in some cases, the institutions upon which we rely, or finding a way around them. What I'm going to do is spend some time today talking about why it is that these institutions matter and how we can find a medium to work in between. My own background is, yes, one in financial services, some 3 decades, the last 7 years of which I became the chief risk officer for a financial services company in the wake of the financial crisis, grappling and dealing with some very tough issues, eye to eye with regulators in the United States, here in the UK, in Dublin, and other jurisdictions, having to answer and respond around the policies, procedures, and controls we had in place to protect investors, to ensure and provide that we were operating within the compliance frameworks and regulatory frameworks that protected their interests, their money, their data, their privacy. From there, with the advent of blockchain, with a focus and commitment on a framework in society that made sense, we've stepped into healthcare. My comments today are not focused on what we're doing specifically at Spiritus, but I'm going to try to distill for you why it is that administrative law and compliance matter and why blockchain matters for administrative law and compliance. I'll look at the origins and history, at least over the last 150 or 200 years, of those institutions and frameworks upon which we rely in these various sectors of society. I'll look at what I call the dual face with regards to distributed ledger technology, administrative law, and compliance. And that really is around, to what extent is it an object of regulation, cryptocurrencies, in finance and other sectors, an object of regulation? And to what extent is a source supportive of? What is it that it's going to bring potentially that will allow the institutions upon which we rely in the administrative state to support us and be dynamic, along with other technologies, to improve that exercise, to make it work better for us as citizens? And then I'll close with some observations around the challenges faced in various sectors that the community around blockchain is going to have to address, and try to ground them and give them a meat and substance so that you can carry those as you think and carry it across sectors of society. So administrative law, centered around the concept that we are governed, again, by the administrative or executive power. That legislative intent, rooted in a common law tradition, that these administrative actions that are taken are subject ultimately to judicial review. Now, across those jurisdictions I just identified, the UK, the US, Canada, the Commonwealth nations, there are distinctions. There are distinctions around what the constitutional framework provides, separation of powers, the relationship between a federal entity and local entities, state entities, provinces in the case of Canada. Property rights, and that should say, barring some formatting issues, ruled by experts. This is really significant when we think about the modern state, because it is expertise upon which we rely. Expertise and insight in food safety, healthcare and life sciences, manufacturing, those things that require engineering and science. There is a tension, and regulators sit at that divide. The emphasis on property rights and ruled by experts. A healthy tension, a necessary tension, a very dynamic one. In a few weeks, I'll be speaking and running a workshop for the community of federal regulators in Canada, some several thousand that come together each year. The Canadian government has asked of all its agencies that they know and understand the transformative potential, not just of blockchain, but other enabling technologies, what the impact is, how can they improve their efficiency, their transparency, how can they focus and derive data and provide evidence-based cost-benefit analysis based on the regulations that they're putting in place. What is that dynamic? And how can they, on behalf of the citizens of Canada, do more? It'll be fascinating. Those regulators are going to be sleeves rolled up. The UK has a good example of that here with the FCA. The Financial Conduct Authority has been running regulatory workshops for some time, encouraging startups, innovators to come to them, providing a consultative framework where they can talk and discuss what those innovations are, but as a regulator, also taking that information back. Some history. Let's put this in context. This is actually public health. What's known among historians as the Sanitary awakening in the 19th century. Industrialization, urbanization, crowding conditions, cholera, smallpox, typhoid, and tuberculosis epidemics. The gentry living into their 30s here in England, data showing that working class individuals and laborers only live to their mid-teens on average. This is illustrating actually a study that was done, and it was groundbreaking. John Snow in the 1850s looked at the relationship between deaths associated with cholera, and the location of wells and pumps. At that point, the belief was the miasma was in the air. He literally brought a pump handle to city officials and demonstrated that that's where the infection was coming from. So he was encouraged, and he discovered that there were 13 wells, and he was able to attribute, yes, at Cambridge and Broad Street, that intersection, that particular pump, but if you look at this whole map, if you go online, you'll see the comprehensive study. Epidemiology, microbiology, not well understood, but actions taken, not just here in the UK, similar actions in states in the United States, Massachusetts and New York, Chicago, also putting together sanitary commissions to evaluate and determine what actions needed to be taken, and there were concrete actions taken. The first real movement well in advance of the science that we have today. In Canada, it's interesting, the British North America Act, one of the first departments that was established, and sensibly so if you think about Canada then as being very much around trade, logging, fur, grains, and the like, very much a focus on their seacoast and fisheries, and therefore, on that long coastline, the Canadian coastline is actually the longest in the world, beacons, buoys, lights, and lighthouses. I was reading testimony to Parliament by the gentleman who took that role. And he was telling what lighthouses they had where to protect from shipwrecks, who went in and conducted the inspections, how frequently. Likewise, they had provisions in the parliamentary legislation around vessel certification and classification. They provided certificates for masters and their mates, as well as oversaw pension funds and workers' issues. Canada, precedent, right around the same time, the 1860s, a different sector of society, but very reflective of where they were and at that time. Pennsylvania, coal mining, where my family ended up from Lithuania and Scotland. Coal towns, anthracite coal towns. This particular disaster in the 1860s that led to 110 deaths, 2 of them children, the miners asphyxiated in the mine, coming from 7 or 8 different ethnic groups, probably unable to even communicate with one another in a common language. There were, in 1907, some 18 disasters leading to over 900 deaths. This led to the Anthracite Coal Safety Act. There was a similar act around bituminous coal, very different mining conditions, and this was a time of strikes and unrest and difficulties. Those regulations, those provisions to protect miners had their precedent at that time. Let's come back to Scotland. And here's another important point about regulation and compliance, being informed by engineering. What I have up here actually represents something that comes from the 1951 journal, the West of Scotland Iron and Steel Institute. Experts in metallurgy, engineers. In this case, the vice president presenting a paper on pressure vessel welding. And his argument was that for these boilers and otherwise, that taking fabricated steel and welding it for pumps and other needs, that they had made tremendous progress since the 1930s in the tonnage that they could handle, the amount of pressure that could be handled depending on the application. But his observation to his peers, engineers who likewise were grappling with these issues, understood the content, understood the studies here, was that defects and the methods by which they were detecting defects and determining that they were statistically meaningful ought to be reconsidered. And at that time, they were looking at inches per mile as some evidence of a quality issue, that safety would be a problem. The direction of the weld seam. Arguments and comments, this includes comments and responses from his peers, very gracious, the fine gentleman, the author. Surely your work is extraordinary. We're all in your debt. But have you observed that perhaps the carbon and sulfur content of the steel itself is an issue and not necessarily the weld? This kind of constructive dialogue among experts. His fundamental argument was, I ought to be able to rely on supersonic exams, not X-ray, to do an initial pass at a far lower cost and identify probable defects, and then the more costly X-ray. The debate becomes standards. Those standards make their way. So in this framework of regulation, we have moved, particularly in such areas as are affected by engineering and science, relying on the empirical, the analytical, the normative, this kind of dialogue among experts. It is part of the fabric of our lives. So when I think about distributed ledger technology and blockchain, I talk about inside out and outside in. To the extent we are interested in policy, law, and regulation and their intersection and the feedback among them as it relates to distributed ledger technology, there are clearly elements, and we see it in finance, that are about how is it that regulators, policymakers, and ultimately lawmakers ought to think about this and ought to regulate it. But similarly, there is so much information and potential, the combination of the data and evidence coming off of distributed ledgers to the extent it is auditable, verifiable, traceable, can rely on it at some level and have assurance. If we can bring that to bear, we may well influence law and regulation in constructive ways to gain efficiency, to be able to do and rely on the analyses that are done in ways we haven't before. That two-way interaction is really important. The tools that regulators have at their hand are ranged from guidance and standards, which some have called the dark matter of regulation. They're quite vague. They give a lot of room, right through to regulations. The means that they have to use, certainly face off with this, matters requiring attention. When I come back the next time, you better have addressed this issue. We're going to be looking, when we visit you again as an examiner, to actual findings or actions they might take, and those actions might include fines, limits on activity, commercial activity, or outright bans. Back to the exercise. Has the regulator acted in a fair, proportional way? Has due process been followed? And to what extent are they accountable? Legitimacy, mandates, accountability. If you spend enough time in distributed ledger and blockchain technology, these issues come up all the time. Who has the authority? To what extent can we rely on them? In the crypto and ICO world, in the United States, by illustration, the idea of inside out is fascinating because depending on where the regulator is coming from or the jurisdiction, they view crypto as something different. There's actually 5 different answers in the United States to what a cryptocurrency is or an ICO. There is the currency side. FinCEN, under Treasury, has considered a money transmission mechanism. Much of the to-do around ICOs is around the SEC arguing that these are securities. The CFTC has been out on front of this, on its front foot, probably arguably of any of the regulators, views it as a commodity. And the state of Wyoming recently, legislation identifying it as property. There are significant regulatory consequences, tax consequences, business consequences to that framework and how it's being addressed. So in the United States, we have a polyglot when it comes to the understanding. It is actually true across the globe that regulators are trying to come to grips, financial regulators, with what this is. So what's happening is we have regulatory arbitrage. It's a gentle way to say people are going to that place where they think they'll have a benign, if not supportive environment in which they can operate legally. There's a long tradition of that in finance. So some of these jurisdictions are establishing themselves in a position they're very comfortable and familiar with in the international landscape. Others are taking on the opportunity to make a declaration around their openness to this. Not to judge, but to know and understand. Coming from the other direction, is blockchain ready? Is distributed ledger technology ready to take on some of the challenges that we propose it to take on? Privacy as understood as a regulatory definition in a jurisdiction under data protection regime, a specific data protection regime, has very fine provisions. And how you handle that technically, the things that you must do to demonstrate that you've executed effectively in alignment with the data protection regime differs. What we learned recently in a conversation with the Chief Information Security Officer of a hospital system in the Midwest of the United States that has 17 hospitals, 3.5 million people in the relevant patient population, is that he processes 4 billion privacy transactions a year. 4 billion. That's just the privacy transaction piece of this. He is using machine learning and AI to get on that. His false negatives and positives are certainly manageable, but that is an eye-opening number. For those who would introduce blockchain into healthcare and mediate patient data and otherwise, do the math. Do the multiplier there. This is the HIPAA regime. GDPR arguably could be more burdensome. Oil and gas decommissioning. So I just talked about high volume transactions around an individual. In the physical world, and certainly here for Scotland, there's a huge issue off the North Sea as we move through what will be several decades of decommissioning. Long cycles, a lot of administrative paperwork, multiple regulators involved, depending on whether you're close to the platform, moving to the 12-mile limit, onshore, handling a waste stream, and otherwise. So it's possible to sit there and say, if I've got an approved game plan and program, now I'm going to execute it. Now I go downstream, I hire in the supply chain, and now I must be able to demonstrate. And I can demonstrate, arguably, through distributed ledger and blockchain technology, across an emerging supply chain that's going to vary across time, but a challenge as well. How do I enable an emergent network that's going to have parties large and small coming and going over years, if not decades? That steel that may have asbestos in it that's sitting on a port on the east of Scotland may sit there and have additional steel added to it and ultimately picked up and moved and smelted after some period of years, changing ownership. Who's accountable? Who has the liability? Arguably, distributed ledger technology has much to bring to the oil and gas decommissioning paperwork stream that's going to be implemented and experienced. Another challenge, and certainly a lot of the use cases we have talk about supply chain and supply chain integrity. And the mindset of protection, there is illegal trafficking as well. This is data that's been gathered from a variety of sources, but you think about the magnitude of the challenge. The drug supply chain gets a lot of publicity here. But in the context of regulation, in the context of jurisdictions with active criminal networks that in some fashion benefit from or are involved in these supply chains, whether it's money laundering or some other purpose, each of these discretely might arguably benefit from some element of distributed ledger and blockchain technology. But the threshold and the challenges are huge, and they're not as much about technology as these trans-jurisdictional issues. On the toxic waste side, and we'll hear more later today, there are provisions, a treaty, a Basel ban on trans-border movement of toxic waste. We know there's abuse of that, but how do we track it? And you can take it through each of these areas. That a state without the means for some change is without the means of its conservation. So to the extent that the institutions upon which we rely, that have grown out of and are part of the administrative state, that we rely to provide for us, for what we define as safe, fair, and equitable, a changing dynamic, that change is necessary. Revolution may be bloody, change is absolutely necessary. So I'm grateful for the time to talk today. I am also grateful for the speakers who are joining us. They will be speaking about how this applies in the legal profession, in accounting, around the circular economy, importantly in finance and in audit. I'll leave you with one thought as well. It's very important that we look to the last step, that we understand what is the first step. And we are at first steps when it comes to distributed ledger. I'll turn it over to Chris.